Network automation is a very thorny subject that requires a lot of questions that need to be asked and a lot of justifications. And if you don't ask the right questions, you may find out that network automation isn't right for you in this episode of the On-Premise IT podcast. Welcome to the On-Premise IT podcast, the only podcast that dares to be both on topic and on location. My name is Tom Hollingsworth, and each episode we bring you the perspectives and opinions of a group of IT luminaries, experts in their fields. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panel of guests before we jump into the premise for today's episode, starting with Jake.
Hi, I'm Jake Khuon. I'm a network architect.
Tim Bertino, network architect, co-host of the Art of Network Engineering podcast, and not an expert in anything.
Jordan Villarreal, network engineer for quite some time.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into the premise for this episode. As you can tell, we have a lot of networking experts in the room, and one of the topics that has been hotly debated for a number of years is the state of network automation. It's something that's going to take my job. It's something that I really need to do. It's something that's going to revolutionize the way that I do things. But the truth is that not everybody needs network automation. So I'm going to open this up to everybody in the room to kind of throw out your thoughts. I mean, we've gone from it's on the horizon and we're all going to be unemployed and we're going to be replaced by AI scripts and robots to, do we really need to do this? So, I mean, you're all practitioners. What do you think?
Well, I don't think it needs to be a religious thing. You have to take into account the level of your staff, the challenges that you have, the scale of the network that you're trying to maintain and manage. A lot of times you can fall into this rabbit hole of, well, we'll automate everything, but then you spend so much time doing that your staff is overworked, understaffed, and can't maintain the network that you already have. It falls apart anyways. So you have to maintain that balance, and you have to apply it strategically.
I agree with this premise because I think it's like anything else in technology. You need to understand the problem that you have first. You need to have a problem in search of a solution rather than a solution in search of a problem. Because I do think there are many networks out there that are not change intensive. They are set and forget to an extent. And when there are changes, at least on a regular basis, it may be to just this device over here, just this device over there, and not at wide scale. So you have to start doing, kind of to your point, Jake, that cost-benefit analysis of how much time am I going to spend trying to figure out how to automate this one thing that I do maybe 3 times in a year.
So, but then does automation have to be a full-on practice? Because there's a wide range of automation out there. So you can get to the point where you're automating and it's part of a CI/CD pipeline and you have automation engineers, and that's, I think, more of the dynamic, the larger, faster deployments or rapid change environments. But let's say we're just updating our SNMP strings and we're just going to write a script for that. Would that be automation? I might consider that automation.
And I had actually listened to a podcast years ago about this, and I think there are different schools of thought. But I do agree that not all things are automation. I think you have abstraction, orchestration, and automation. So when it comes to writing scripts, I see that as being abstraction.
Okay.
You are coming up with a use case and you're writing a script and pushing it out. And then you have things like orchestration that are taking multiple tasks and tying those together. And then you tie that into automation that is pulling all of those different orchestrated components together. That's what I see as true automation. So I do see that abstraction and scripting is definitely useful if you have those use cases of, I have this one configuration line that I have to change, but I have to do it in 300 devices. I definitely see that as being beneficial.
And there's also a difference between investing a huge amount of staff resources into building a piece of automation as opposed to integrating something that's already been built.
Yes.
That's an easy step. I mean, that's a very low key effort. And if that gets you to 90% of becoming a more stable and reliable network and takes only 5% of your staff resources to do it, sure, that's an easy win. But there are instances where you end up hiring an entire team to build your automation platform, and at the end of it, you've only solved like 10% of your problems.
And I think that's a good point, that we spend a lot of time talking about the fact that we're trying to create like a force multiplier where we're using automation to make our engineers more efficient. When in fact, a lot of what people are really loving about the fact that automation and orchestration are being put in is that it's removing the process of error-prone problems. Like, how many times have you accidentally pasted the wrong script or the wrong config file into the wrong device, or done something like, I fat-fingered an IP address and there was no way to validate the changes or something like that. Whereas with a proper orchestration automation system, there are guardrails in place. Does this IP address make sense for the change that you're trying to make? Is there a way for me to deploy this configuration with a back-off timer or something like that? And so a lot of people are saying, maybe I don't need to automate the tasks. I need to put some kind of a thing in place so that when people do go log in to make changes, either it's validated, or better yet, it actually logs when the changes are made, so that when someone calls support and they're like, well, it doesn't work. Well, did you change anything? No. Well, except for that thing that I did that I wasn't supposed to tell anybody that I was going to try to do.
And that's exactly where I think that automation and infrastructure as code solutions make sense from that compliance standpoint of you have a standard config that you want to have statewise on all of your devices. You want something that is going to alert, and as much as you may trust it, go ahead and revert any changes that get made.
And so automation should be a vehicle by which, one of the vehicles by which you execute a policy or a plan or a design. So if you don't have that to start out with, then you can't just simply say, we'll automate everything and it'll fix things. That doesn't, because you have nowhere to start from.
And it actually brings up a really good point that we heard at Networking Field Day from Ali Sheikh from Graphiant. Automating things that are already there is not really solving any problems. It's just making the broken things move faster. Whereas one of the things that folks that are kind of heavy into this are saying is we need to re-architect the way that we do stuff. We need to change the processes. We don't just need to make VLAN propagation, 9 seconds faster or whatever. Do you feel like automation in and of itself isn't really solving the problem, but it's forcing people to think about new ideas of how they need to program their networks to make the problems that we're experiencing in networking and other systems engineering go away because we're doing things better now that we know better?
I don't think enough network engineers know how to even go about answering that question. That there's so many engineers out there that they know how to set up BGP, and they're going to keep on setting up BGP. And to get them to think differently, it's not that it's not going to happen, but it requires a different force, a management force, a business force, to help get them the tools, the backing, the time that they need to even start considering, all right, how do I do this better, and lead into automation potentially.
That's where you need to find that happy medium. You brought up an interesting point in that, let's even say that we have a really good use case for automation. You then need to make the conscious effort of, okay, are we going to try to do this in-house, homegrown, or are we going to go find a solution? And where I'm going with this is, even if you get 1 or 2 people or a team to start learning how to do scripting or even full-blown automation, you then run a risk of they've built custom tool sets that now they only know, and we have that in-house. So as we have churn of people leaving the organization, we now have a solution that maybe or maybe not people that are still here know how to support.
And that goes back to the whole point of you have to look at your individual organization to determine whether or not you can, one, attract the people that will be able to maintain that or build that platform in the first place. There are plenty of industries out there that would love automation, that maybe even require it, but they can't get the talent because some engineer out there looking for a job in a high-paying industry, or it doesn't matter what the pay is, but in the industry in general, isn't going to get excited about working on automation for a pet food company.
So Tim, to your point though, like you're possibly inheriting code that somebody else didn't develop. Don't network engineers deal with that every time they change jobs? Like, when was the last time that you walked into a network that was set up identically to another network? Now, granted, there's some parameters in there. Like, if you're using BGP, there's only so many different ways
there
you
are
could
protocols.
potentially configure it. But then does that become a discipline that gets easier the more that we become automators? If we're network engineers that are going to become automators, the more we see it, the more we do it, the less cumbersome that not lift, but that transfer is when we pick up somebody else's code.
It would have to be repetition at that point. It would have to be something, you would have to turn automation almost into another networking protocol that somebody has to learn. And that's where the culture shift comes, which I think a lot of these vendors that are out there that are pushing automation as a skill set, because I think that's the reason why we're talking about automation so much, is the vendors are making us talk about it so much. They're creating scripting and automation level certifications, and they're pushing it out in different curriculums. So if that continues to shift and this curriculum gets into college level courses and trade school level courses, then the culture, I think, will swing. And that's what's going to happen to get the adoption there, just like any other network protocol.
And to your point about abstraction, that's where it becomes important to, if you're going to automate to an abstraction, because otherwise you're just essentially locking yourself into the same mechanism of a particular vendor code set or vendor feature set or vendor syntax that won't allow you to essentially enjoy the benefits of having a flexible platform that can handle the day-to-day tasks regardless of vendors.
So you talked about the fact that vendors really want to push automation. They want to have groups of people who are familiar, even if it's just with the way that they do automation of their systems, or you're familiar with the way that they use their orchestration platform. Could it be that the vendors want that not because they want to make better network engineers, but they want to reduce support calls by saying, oh, well, if you follow these guidelines from our system, we've noticed that 60% of the calls that we get involve these things, and automation will remove those so that we can reduce the support costs that we have to put out and focus our people on the really hard problems like code bugs.
It's funny that you say that, because to me, I'm thinking that this comes full circle. Isn't that, and maybe this is just legend, but isn't that kind of the reason why the CCIE program was brought about? Was there were so many support cases that were coming in that Cisco ended up saying, we need to develop this certification platform to where we get people that are out in the customer environments certified and are able to troubleshoot a lot of this stuff before they even call us.
Well,
it's interesting.
I would argue that the CCIE program is meant to be more of a marketing tool for Cisco in general. And I don't want to pick on Cisco because other vendors have same type of programs. But to your point, I kind of see it the other way around, where the vendors are pushing automation so that they can then have another product that they can sell in the form of trained automation engineers that are then certified by them.
But we run into the same problem that we had earlier that we talked about. In order to do that, you have to put that system on top of whatever is already there. But we don't have to do that in some other place, the cloud. Because everybody has to change if they're going into the cloud. We have to shift our mindset. We have to look at things in a different way. We have to build things from scratch, more or less, to make it work properly. Is part of what we're seeing the shift of cloud-like thinking moving down into the enterprise to say this process needs to be repeatable and predictable and it needs to be set up in such a way that we can have things doing it for us rather than having to get onto the switches and create multi-tenant VRFs to do these kinds of things. Whereas what I would normally do is I'd log into AWS and I'd click a couple boxes and it'd just be done.
Well, managing and deploying services in the cloud also requires a certain amount of knowledge of the cloud console platform itself. Yeah, you can easily click a few buttons in AWS and deploy something, but that's just like deploying a switch, bare metal switch. You can do that as well, but the amount of sophistication will eventually require you to go through and learn a lot of the advanced features of the AWS console. I will say that I've always had to create an AWS instance at least 3 times to get it right. And I don't know if it's just me, but to do it exactly what I wanted to do, I've always had to recreate it at least 3 times. And it takes a lot more than just if you're really utilizing all the features of that cloud platform, it takes a lot more than just a couple of clicks.
But isn't that kind of the benefit, maybe why automation becomes easier within the cloud? Because you can tear down and rebuild and tear down and rebuild so rapidly within the cloud. Now, maybe you can do that on-prem if you have a lab, or maybe you can do some of that if you have some sims or some emulators. And then, there's a whole separate line of conversations of, can you really architect everything that you're looking to do within an emulator?
Within Eve or within GNS?
Or even if you're using, it's not Viral anymore, but CML, there's always going to be differences between the software and the actual hardware with the ASICs.
Sure.
So does that make automation easier for cloud because you can just scale it down, not necessarily scale it down, but tear it down and build it back up so rapidly?
It's that repetition again.
Yeah. It certainly makes it maybe not easier, but it certainly makes it more
attainable,
less risky, and I guess attainable would be a good term for it.
Yeah.
So we come back to the question of, can automation remove bad decisions from the loop enough that it's a preferred method of creating configuration or deploying systems, not because it's any faster, but because it reduces extra time on the back end of trying to fix problems that we introduced ourselves unknowingly?
Well, I mean, how much of that technical debt are we going to have time as engineers to unwind and potentially rebuild using automation?
But I go back to the whole point of it's, in some ways, we just introduced cloud into this, but the whole cloud environment, if you were to take that case, it's and the argument that you could just tear things down and rebuild it, that's more of a crutch. Like, I think the real problem that you're trying to solve is your internal engineering practices and processes, which, even if you go into the cloud even if you're entirely in the cloud, if you carry that baggage of bad practices, that'll translate into the cloud. And what happens is the cloud also gives you the ability to tear down things quickly, so whether or not you want to or not, right? So, so if you take those bad practices or those immature practices, and you bring them into a cloud environment, or you bring them into an automation platform, then you have the ability to destroy your network, your infrastructure, even quicker. So it's a double-edged scale. It's a double-edged sword.
So then, if it's practice, we're talking bad practice. Then is that we should try and fix practices before we try and really? You want to dabble with automation, you want to tinker, whatever. Okay, have fun. But if you're going to make it a practice, then you need to get your house in order outside of like, okay, is my hardware all named the same?
Right.
Well, do we have change management? Do we have auditing? Do we have peer reviews on code that's getting pushed?
I love this point because I think we talked about how vendors push automation in the learning of automation. And I think that that is something that is undersold, is that inherent network design should be understood and in place beforehand, because automation really works well when you have variables and templates. When you have 10 different sites and those 10 different sites have services that do relatively the same thing, but they're configured in 10 different ways, at what point is automation good for you at that point? I think you need to start with solid network design, and that isn't something that should be overlooked.
So I've talked to a lot of companies, a lot of smart people who have been pushing automation for quite a while, and they always come back to me and say, well, a lot of companies aren't ready for it yet. They're either stuck in the start phase or they're stuck right after the start phase where they don't know what they want to do yet. So as 3 experienced networking professionals, my question is, what should those companies be asking to decide if automation is right for them?
I go back to what I said originally, and that's what problems need to be solved, and who do they have to solve it? What is the skill level of their team? Will it cost more to hire a bunch of skilled automation engineers? Or will it cost more in terms of time and resources to train their existing engineers? Or can they go out and buy an automation package that will work for them? Or maybe they don't really need to automate anything. Maybe what they're doing now just requires better practices.
I think the question at a high level is, does the network, what the network does, how closely tied to that, how closely is that tied to how I make money? How closely is network operations aligned with whatever it is that gets everybody paid? And if it's uptime, it's scale, it's whatever it is within there that's part of that calculation, then you can start to make arguments for why we should do this better. Or if you can point to a competitor sometimes, oh, hey, you know, we're company A, but company B is starting to do this. Maybe that can be a driver sometimes. But to get it at that high level of management, if you can tie what you're doing to the money, then you should at least start to get that backing.
Yeah.
That's similar to what I was going to say. I agree that you need to start with, what's the problem? What are you trying to solve? And then as far as a question that these vendors can ask is very similar to what you said, Jordan, in that, is the network a differentiator in the business? Or, to look at it the other side, right now, is the network a hindrance? Do sysadmin teams, when they're spinning up services, do they have to sit and wait on the network to be built or configured before they can do what they need to do? If the answer to either one of those is the network a differentiator or is it a hindrance to business, if either one of those is yes, that might be where you need to start looking at automation solutions.
Well, as you can tell from the conversation, automation is not a one-size-fits-all solution to every problem you're going to have. You're going to have to do some homework. You're going to have to try to figure out if this solution meets the needs that you have, and is it worth it? Because if you implement automation in a place where it doesn't make sense, then you just have added one more problem to the list of things that you need to deal with. However, if it does what it's supposed to do, and you have teams that are ready to implement it in the way that it needs to be used, and maybe even change some of your processes and your policies to support automation, then what you'll find in the long run is that you'll have happier network engineers that make fewer mistakes and have more time to work on the really hard problems. That'll just about do it for this episode of the On-Premise IT Podcast. The newest episode can always be found on our website at gestaltit.com or on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/gestaltitvideo. We also provide it as a podcast feed, so just search for On-Premise IT Podcast in your favorite podcast application of choice. We have a new episode coming out about every 2 weeks, so we will hope to see you for another great episode very soon.